What can you tell managers, executive, or anybody actually, a professional who wants to step out of their comfort zone? How can they do it?
They should read my book.
No, come on.
Joke.
Welcome to the Masks Off podcast, Leadership Strategies, No Disguises. I'm Razwana Waheed, and together with my co-host Olivier Larvor, we talk to the smartest people in the world of leadership, change and psychology to give leaders real strategies to bring human back to the workplace.
If you would like to support our show, please subscribe to our channel, like us, or share this episode on your social media. It will help us greatly.
In this episode, we talk to professor and author Andy Molinsky on pushing past comfort zones, how to overcome imposter syndrome as a leader in business.
As leaders or managers or executives, I think they hear constantly that they need to get out of their comfort zone because of this environment full of challenges. We need to change, we need to try new stuff. I believe in your book you have interviewed executives and managers and leaders. So what is their biggest fear or their biggest problems to get out of their comfort zone?
There was a study done a couple of years ago that by a consulting firm, and it was reported in Harvard Business Review that the biggest fear of top executives in terms of getting outside their comfort zone is afraid that people will discover their incompetence.
Really?
Wow.
So, in my experience, speaking with executives and senior managers and so on, I think it's very personal what the particular sort of pain point is. And also it's very situational. It depends on what you're talking about. Are you talking about, motivating my employees? Are you talking about giving a big speech? Are you talking about delivering bad news? What exactly are you talking about? It depends. Because I think it depends on the person and on the situation. Some people are afraid about that they'll be seen as an incompetent person, and they sort of feel the imposter syndrome, even among top executives. Other people worry that people will hate them because oftentimes executives are facing decisions that aren't easy decisions.
Right.
You're going to upset certain people. It's just not so easy and clear cut. And so some people are afraid that they're going to hurt people. Other times, executives, I think, feel inauthentic stepping into a new role or a task that they're not used to. It just doesn't feel like who they are. That's probably a challenge I heard the most among individual performers becoming managers. That's not really as much I heard among executives, but more among people who were fantastic star individual performers doing their thing, and then all of a sudden they get promoted, yay, but now they're managers. And as a manager, your job is completely different. So I guess maybe it's not a satisfying answer, but to me, it's the accurate answer that it really depends.
I like that because it's like very personal. For some people, it's about public speaking. You mentioned that a lot in your keynotes, like the fear of speaking. But for some people, like I'm sure Raz, she's very good at public speaking. It can be something else. So it's very personal stuff. But there's something to me, and I think this is what you point out in your book. It's the why we are doing this. We know that we need to get out of our comfort zone, so just do it. Let's go for it, because this is where the magic happens, outside the comfort zone. God's sake, just do it. Go for it. But it's not so easy. Can you explain this, the why of why it's not so easy?
For any executives, managers out there listening, I don't want to portray myself as saying you have to get outside your comfort zone. Just go outside your comfort zone. I don't know how useful advice that is. As an executive, in certain situations, you do want to be a risk taker, but a smart risk taker. There are situations where you're going to have to step outside your comfort zone, whether it's a new set of responsibilities, whether it's a new assignment, whether it's a new business, whether it's a new, whatever it might be, some sort of inflection point, some transition point in your own career and developmental trajectory. That's where you're often encountering those moments where you need to step outside your comfort zone if you're going to grow and learn and potentially achieve what you're hoping to achieve. But I don't think it means that you always have to step outside your comfort zone in every situation. That seems seems sensible, really,
It's a good point, I think. Yeah.
Right. And in terms of the question about why is really essential, because the why gives you sort of a sense of conviction about the purpose that for which you're doing this. Because if you're feeling inauthentic, if you're feeling worried about your competence, if you're worried that you're going to anger people and so on and so forth, it's very easy to avoid whatever you're thinking of doing, to justify that, we don't really need to do this right now, to rationalize yourself out of doing it, especially executives who have a lot of flexibility and autonomy to structure their lives and make decisions. You're accountable as an executive, but you're less accountable than you were when you were lower down on the chain in some ways. And so there's a great possibility to avoid. I think that the why sort of pushes you and gives you sort of that wind at your back to be able to do something that you need to do, but that's against the grain of your habit, your personality, and so on.
What you said earlier about you don't necessarily have to take risks all the time. Whatever risks you take have to be smart risks. I think that's really important, because I don't think that as managers or leaders, you have to do everything yourself. If, for example, you have not a fear, but you don't think you're a competent coach when you're coaching your team, you can always hire somebody else in, because the coaching is important. Who does it isn't necessarily important. It's what the coaching achieves that's connected to your why. And on that note, for people that are listening, because we like to be quite practical and really give our listeners something to take away that they can implement today. So if there is a manager or a leader listening that is struggling to understand how they can connect a certain project or task to their why, how would you advise they do it? How would they discover their why?
First of all, you should ask yourself quite simply, what's important about this for me? And it could be a professional answer. And oftentimes, in the context of what we're talking about, it is a very professional answer. It could be, I need to do this because this is critical for my business. In a sense, there's multiple stakeholders. I need to do this because it's very important for people who have invested in my business. I need to do this because maybe there's a career reason. Maybe I have always wanted to become a leader. I have always had the ambition to become a leader, to become an executive, because I think that I would like to be able to do good in the world. And frankly, I'm ambitious and I want to become a leader. And if this is what it takes, this is what I'm going to do. Other time, or I need to support my team. That there are a lot of people counting on me. There are a lot of people who have chosen to work with me. Maybe this is a startup situation, chosen to work with me in this organization and taken risks to do it. That really gives me motivation to step outside my comfort zone, because in a way they've sacrificed for me. The context is always different. It could also be personal. A lot of business people have families, right? Right. So for me, a source of conviction, I have two children, and I'm always trying to push them outside their comfort zone. I try to practice what I preach. And if I see that in my own life, that I seem to be avoiding things outside my comfort zone, I start to think about what kind of role model I want to be. Am I really doing what I'm telling them they need to do? And that ends up being a very powerful source of conviction for me. My point is that I don't think you have to choose a single source of conviction. I think oftentimes it's even more powerful if there are multiple sources of conviction that kind of get behind you to try to step outside your comfort zone. But think broadly, think about all the aspects of your life, all the aspects of that particular ambition or task that you have. And I don't think it'll be hard if you take a moment to think about conviction.
I would like to go back to something that you mentioned early on. It's the imposter syndrome, because I believe a lot of managers and leaders, even CEOs, as you mentioned, have this imposter syndrome. Can you explain what is it exactly and what can we do about it?
I think a good example of it is Natalie Portman, the actress, worldwide famous actress, Israeli-American actress. I imagine everyone listening probably knows who she is, right? Yeah. She went back after a bit in her acting career. She went back to Harvard to do a undergraduate college degree at Harvard. No one really knew it because she didn't talk about it at the time, but years later, she described how much of an imposter she felt stepping into these classroom situations. She thought they must think that I'm just some dumb actress. that I completely don't belong here, that I don't even deserve to be here. And she gave a very powerful speech. It's on YouTube. You can see it. She comes back to Harvard and she gives a commencement address 10 years later describing what it felt like. That's just one story and one example. But I think a lot of CEOs, I think a lot of executives feel this. And I also think that it's very difficult to talk about it. People have certain expectations of you in this role. You might have expectations of yourself. And to sort of portray that type of vulnerability is pretty rare. And potentially people might experience it as dangerous, right? Because if I show my vulnerability in that way, will people respect me? I think it's a challenge, it's a problem, but it's really only a problem if it leads to dysfunctional behavior, right? It's not a problem if you feel it, because it's natural to feel it, right? I don't think that's a problem. I think the problem is when it leads you to dysfunctional behavior. For example, avoiding things, or having your business ultimately avoid things that probably would be quite sensible for the business, but you're afraid to put yourself in a vulnerable position where you feel like even more of an imposter, and so on and so forth. And that your vulnerability and your anxiety around this sort of psychological issue ends up causing you to engage in sort of dysfunctional or, less than effective behaviors that ultimately harm you and your business. That's where it gets problematic. The feelings themselves, the most natural thing in the world.
I've experienced it a lot, actually, myself. You mentioned the word vulnerability a lot, during this conversation. So is it the key, actually? A CEO, in their head, I believe, they have to know everything. They have to be strong, they have to know all the answers, they have to inspire people, they have to motivate everyone. This is what they believe, or this is the ideal image of a CEO. Is the solution just to say, well, I don't know, or, I need your help? Is it the key to fight this imposter syndrome?
I think it's a complex situation, because I think that organizational and national culture makes a big difference too, right? There are certain cultures where it would be very countercultural to display this type of vulnerability. And in the end, it just simply might not work, right? But if we're talking about a culture where it's at least plausible or possible to do so, I think it would be quite effective to say, I'm learning just like you are. I have strengths, I have areas that I'm working on, just like everyone in this company. But what I'm going to do, and what I want you to do, is to identify your weaknesses, identify the areas that you need to work on, and I'm going to really be diligent in trying to work on those. Do you know what I mean? It's like you can express and reveal areas of weakness that you have, but I think what's critical is not then just saying, oh, yeah, okay, that's it. I have these areas of weakness, and it's a problem for me, and that's that. I think what's more powerful is to say, these are the areas I need to work on. These are the questions I simply don't have answers to, but I'm going to really work hard and develop a plan to try to fill those gaps. You don't want people to hide their problems. You don't want people to sort of hide their vulnerabilities, because you're going to have dysfunction at the lower level as well. You want them to feel comfortable expressing them, revealing them, but to have the courage and the dedication and the sort of stick-to-itness to say, I'm going to work on these, right? And so I think that's what you want.
That's the key, though, isn't it? I think the leading by example. If I think back to the leaders that I've admired in the past in the jobs that I've had, they're the ones who have displayed some vulnerability, but it has a purpose. It's not just being open for the sake of being open. There is a reason for it, and it has been because the team will then adopt that behavior, and it permeates through the business. One thing, Andy, I wanted to touch on after reading some of your work around the cross-cultural communication, and you mentioned that for some cultures, a leader being too vulnerable isn't a good thing, but then there are some cultures where when you're in the team, being too vulnerable or too outspoken isn't a good thing either. So if we have a situation where a leader has a team that is a mix of cultures, which we get a lot in the Western world, you have people from Asian backgrounds, from Latin American backgrounds, from European backgrounds, how would a leader encourage openness in their team?
It's a really tough question.
That's why you're here.
We wanted to put you on the spot, Andy.
And you have 30 seconds before answering.
No, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's important also to remember that it's not just your cultural background that sort of impacts your willingness to expose your vulnerabilities and that you're learning and so on. It's also your personality. So you've got personality, you've got culture, because not everyone is typical of the culture that they come from, in a sense. Like I'm American, you're French. I'm not sure where you're from.
I'm British.
You're British, okay.
Yeah.
You know, are we sort of emblematic of the exact cultures that we come from? Probably on some areas, maybe, in some areas, maybe not, right? So I think it's important for a leader to put their finger on the pulse of not just the cultural background, but also the personalities in the team, right? So I teach MBA students. You might think that an Asian female MBA student might be, the stereotype is that they're quiet in class and that they don't speak very much. That's a stereotype. The reality is that I have had some female MBA students from China who are the most outspoken people you have ever seen. And plus I've also had some on the opposite side of the spectrum. So I think that you can't just sort of take the cultural stereotype. You need to understand what you actually have on the team. I think it's also important to understand not just the individual people, but also the makeup. Is this a group of 3 Germans and 3 Koreans? You know, if so, you might start to have some hypotheses or some ideas going in of what you might expect, what clashes you might expect. So the Germans might be quite direct in their communication style, whereas the Koreans might be quite indirect. And so that direct, you might realize going in that a touch point for you probably is going to be the directness of your communication style. And then it's your job as a leader, I think, to understand what the team norm is going to be and to be pretty explicit about that, like what the team culture is going to be, because you've got national culture, you've got personality, but then as a leader, you have the capacity to mold the norms and the rules and the expectations of your team. And you can be quite explicit about that. Showing that you understand that people come from different backgrounds, but that these are the norms of the team. And sometimes it's the norms of the organization even. So I know organizations that struggle with issues like this. For example, feedback's a good one, because for an organization that wants to get a lot of feedback about what's going wrong because they want to try to correct it. There's a pharmaceutical company I was talking with last year about this exact issue. They wanted a lot of feedback about what's going wrong because they really want to correct it quickly. But there are many people in the organization who come from cultures where it would be inappropriate to sort of talk about feedback and problems, especially to their superiors. And they didn't feel comfortable doing that. And so they needed to institute a organizational culture. Yes, you might come from this national culture. Yes, you might have this personal background, but you are here at company X, and company X's culture is this. Do you know what I mean? I think that's really important for leaders. So in some ways, a culture and personality accounting of what you have on your team, and then a thoughtful decision-making process about what norms that you think are going to be important for you to realize your vision, you know, what you're in it for, and then to create sort of habits and practices to reinforce those.
I would like to go back to the comfort zone thing. Sorry, that's my thing at the moment, not the cultural thing. Regarding the solution, actually, the tips. How, because this is all, you know, I'm sure now our listeners, okay, how do I go there? Because it's not about telling the person to go there or read a motivational quote or a book. It's really, it comes from you, I think, you know, from where you stand. So what can you tell managers, executive, or anybody actually, a professional who wants to step out of their comfort zone? How can they do it?
They should read my book.
No, come on.
Joke. No, it's not a joke, but yeah.
Of course it's not a joke, yeah.
So I spent a lot of time thinking about this, obviously. Here's what I would say about it. If you go to the internet, you're going to see pictures of fish jumping out of fish bowls, people jumping off cliffs, and you're going to see what you're going to see is everyone saying, take the leap. You just have to take the leap, right? Now, that is actually true.
Okay.
However, it's easier said than done. And that's the catch, because there's great power from actually taking a leap. And we can talk about that. There is really tremendous power from giving something a try and taking a leap. But it's much harder, I think, to get to that point than is portrayed on the internet. So that's exactly what my book's about and what my work's about. It's trying to identify what your pain points are, what your challenges are, what your sort of, I call them psychological roadblocks, what they are for you. And then I have 3 tools, and we sort of touched upon them a little bit earlier. I wanted to boil it down to something that would be very usable. And so there are 3 key tools, and we could talk about them if you want.
Absolutely. We need the solution right now.
Yeah, so the solutions. Number 1, conviction. And we talked about this earlier.
Right.
The idea of finding your source of conviction. Why is it worth it for you when every bone in your body, psychologically speaking, is saying no, is saying avoid, don't do this? Why is it worth it for you to actually approach and do it? And I think that's critical, finding that source of conviction. We talked about that earlier, about where that comes from and what it is. The second thing is, I have to say, the second thing is like the most exciting aspect of what I found, I have to tell you, and also the most surprising. And that's what I call customization. And that's the idea that there's no one-size-fits-all way to step outside your comfort zone. What people were able to do, and they kept talking about this, they didn't use the word customization, of course, that's my term, but they kept saying essentially that. And what they said was that they were able to tweak, like make a little slight minor personalization or adjustment to their situation to make it just a little bit easier for them. Sometimes it was body language, sometimes it was the words they used, sometimes it was timing, sometimes it was the context, changing the context a little, sometimes it was bringing a prop, like an actual physical prop to the situation. But whatever it was, finding some way to make it yours a little bit, and there are a lot of different ways to do it, that made it just a little bit easier to take the leap. And then finally, and we could talk about examples if you want, but finally, the last one was clarity, and I call it clarity because I think that in these situations where fear and anxiety is bubbled up, a lot of times we have the tendency to go to the negative extreme. Like I'm afraid of public speaking. I'm envisioning what it's going to be like. I'm going to faint. It's going to be awful. I'll never do it. Or envisioning a new direction for your business. There's no way that's going to work. This is going to be awful. I'm going to be fired, and I'll never get a job in this industry. That's what psychologists call catastrophizing. Now, the other side, the other side of the framework is sort of idealized, equally unrealistic thinking. Right? I'm only giving a public speech if I'm the best TED talker ever. I think our anxieties cause us to swing in our mind to these 2 different directions. And what I found that people who are most successful were able to sort of claim some more realistic, grounded perspective on their situation. And that's what I call clarity. So you got clarity, customization, and conviction. And I'll say one last thing here. The reason these are important is because if you can apply these to your situation, to whatever you're thinking about that's outside your comfort zone, it increases the chances that you're willing to take that leap. And when you're able to take the leap, what happens oftentimes, and I heard it so many times, it was like after a while, it was just like I was expecting to hear it and I heard it. And people describe these discoveries, these sort of personal discoveries that they had when they took the leap. Number 1, this isn't as hard as I thought it was. Number two, I'm better at this than I thought I was. Even a little bit, right? And when you start to have that personal learning involved in taking a leap, it encourages you to try it again. And then when you can try it again, you get into a bit more of a positive spiral of sort of trying and learning and experimenting and so on, as opposed to the negative spiral of avoidance. And so that is why these tools are so important. So, I mean, that's a long answer, but that's my answer.
That's perfect, actually. Perfect. And the rest is in the book.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's the book right there. So you don't need to buy it.
We got it.
You got it right there.
Thank you. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Once again, if you would like to support our show, please subscribe to our channel, like us, or share this episode on your social media. Merci.